just take their seats and be as comfortable as you can. And we very much appreciate that people have made it here on time, given the weather events. There's still about 40 or 50 people who have registered and haven't arrived as yet. So dare I say, not all of those people will make it, but some people might file in over the next 15, 20 minutes. So for those people who don't know me, I'm Russell Westacott. I'm the CEO of Seniors' Rights Service. Again, thanks for coming in today. And it's good to see such a good roll-up of people. I must say I was a little disappointed when I looked at the registration list the other day to see so few men had registered for this event. But nonetheless, it's good to have all the people here in the room with us. When Seniors' Rights Service did the 5th National Elder Abuse Conference back in February, the surprising statistic that came out of that conference was that women are 2.5 times more likely to be victims of elder abuse. And so our organisation thought that it was time that we actually put a greater spotlight on that particular issue. And obviously, elder abuse is multifactorial in how it can occur and some of the things that might be the drivers. And today we're going to hear some of those stories about what the drivers are. And we're also going to have a discussion about what it is that we might need to do to resolve or try to resolve some of those issues. Okay, so I'm going to hand things over. I'm on stage literally for a very short period of time, and I'm handing things over to Auntie Anne Weldon to do a welcome to country. And then after Auntie Anne, we're going to hear a few words from Margaret Duckett, who is the President-designate of Seniors' Rights Service, and people will be aware that after lunch today, Seniors' Rights Service is having its annual general meeting. I just want to mention that the hashtag, in case people are using Twitter or any other social media, the hashtag that we're using for this event is #WomenAging, or one word, and spelling ageing with a G, not the American style. Okay, so thanks all. I'm handing it over now to Auntie Anne Weldon. Thank you.
Well, good morning, all of you fine people. Good morning, Jade. And I was just having a wonderful conversation with Rosalind. Susan, sorry, Rosalind. Forgive me. I'm not too bright at this time of the year. Really, I'm not. So tired. And I end up saying, Deb, where's Deb? Watch that young girl grow up. She's live next door. We live next door to each other in Dullah. Yeah, so very smart, highly intelligent, and come from a beautiful family. So good morning, all of you other beautiful people that have certainly travelled through the wonderful rain. It is wonderful. We either complain if we don't get it, and we complain when it's too much, but I just think it's wonderful. It certainly kept me on my toes driving here this morning. Firstly, I need to make you aware that I am a Wiradjuri Koori Balang. And so what that means is this particular part of Aboriginal country, I'm an Aboriginal, well, Koori is Aboriginal in my language, Balang is woman, and Wiradjuri is a mighty nation of Aboriginal nations, and our territory or our boundaries start at the foot of the Blue Mountains, and we go all the way out to, it goes up as far as Nyngan, down as far as Cuts. So it's a rather large nation with a larger land base. And Wiradjuri means the three rivers people, and I belong to the Clare River. So the three main rivers in Wiradjuri country, which is our bloodline, our songline, our storyline, is the Murrumbidgee River, the Womble, which has been renamed the Macquarie, and the Clare, or the young ones say Glare River, but Clare River, which is the Lachlan. And I grew up in Irramby Aboriginal Reserve, which is in Cowra, New South Wales. And being a senior, when I was born, we didn't have rights. We weren't classified as human beings of our own country. And that didn't come until after 1967, when they decided that we were able to vote and be considered as citizens of our country. And my journey through my upbringing was one where we were controlled by a mission manager and his wife. So we lived under extreme control on that reserve. And if you've heard that song that Archie wrote, Archie Roach is actually, they took the children away when he talks about they fenced us in like sheep. Well, believe you me, we were fenced in like sheep. And we had to get permission. You couldn't do any, if you left, you were not allowed to come back. If my mother kept me home from school, she would have to get permission or make sure that the mission manager and his wife knew. And we had horrible experiences lining up on a Saturday morning on the reserve in the treatment room where they would look at our heads, looking through our hair, and they'd give us these shocking tablets, and then we would get our supply of sheep dip. So you were lined up, and you had to go through this inspection, and I'll never forget that. But one thing that I loved about my upbringing was the fact that we were all there together, that my family and all of the other families, we all were together on our reserve, and we certainly cared and shared. And the essence of my culture was that our elders, the older ones, certainly there was the link and the upbringing. My upbringing as a child was certainly led by the elders, by old people. So it was the old and young that looked out, and you had to, that is a part of our customs and culture. So, it's wonderful for me now to take up that place with my grandchildren, because I've got 11 that range from the age of 26 to 5. So, but, it is wonderful to be here at this particular function, and the beauty of it is that we've been there, done that, and now, the wisdom and your journeys can certainly help pave the way for young ones to come. And, I certainly believe that, with children, we have the ability to certainly encourage them and make sure that they do succeed. And I'm an elder of New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, and also a board member of Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. So I just wanted to share that with you, just a little bit of my story and my journey through life, because it's absolutely deadly just being here with older people, rather than being around with all them young ones and you feel real old. Yeah, but never mind. For this particular part of Eora country, Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council is the cultural authority and custodian of culture, heritage, land and waterways. And I stand proud of my people's richness of our culture and our strong resilience. And I acknowledge all other Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders and non-Aboriginal brothers and sisters here in this room at the gathering this morning. And I acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we gather, the Eora Nation and the Gadigal clan. For the Gadigal clan were one of 29 clan groups of this particular part of Eora country. And I pay my respects to all elders, past, present, and indeed elders of tomorrow, from our many Aboriginal nations and non-Aboriginal nations across Australia, and express my deepest appreciation for the sacrifices that our elders have made to build a better future for us all. But undeniably, history has certainly dealt my people, Aboriginal people, unjust treatment, and sadly we continue to be paralysed by these unfortunate injustices. But for my people, Aboriginal Australia, we have existed and belong to this land that stretches beyond 60,000 years. We are one of the richest and the oldest continuing cultures in the world, and our practices of culture and language has been handed down to hundreds and hundreds of generations, and as I speak, I've certainly handed it on to my children and my grandchildren and grandnieces and nephews. For I learnt my Wiradjuri culture and traditions by the teaching and by listening to my elders. For my elders informed the truth from their experiences, and the facts are seen through their eyes, and I call them the strong, clever ones. For we believe the teaching of our ancestors and elders will light our way through uncertain future, and we look to further our vision through the realisation of endeavours that protect our diverse cultures, our lands, our language, our emotional and our spiritual well-being, our ceremonial ways of prayer, and through our journeys educate and nurture our children and grandchildren. And as a Wiradjuri Kuri Balang, I would like you to celebrate, to be proud and stand with us, to walk beside us. Please don't walk ahead of us and allow us Aboriginal people to share the wealth that our country has to offer. And it is doing this with us instead of making decisions for us that will allow us to create our own pathways and reach our own full potential. For Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, we certainly promote a vision of working together as one community and to achieve as one community. And our boundary spans from the Hawkesbury River to the north, the Nepean to the west and the Georges River to the south. So as an elder and as a board member, but more importantly with the permission of Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, it is with honour that I welcome you all here this morning to the land of the Eora Nation. And I take this opportunity also to thank Seniors' Rights Service. You know, it's wonderful that, you know, we have a Seniors' Rights Service, absolutely critical, and a major, you know, a major organisation that needs to certainly exist to protect our rights. And also, you know, I'm delighted to actually have been asked to come here and conduct the welcome at your Women, Ageing and Disadvantaged Symposium. I mean, I don't know about all you other women, but one thing that I really get annoyed with, being older, I mean, yeah, you've got aches and pains and, you know, so the pipes rust up and the joints need to be tightened up, and it's getting the hair coloured, you know. You know, because if I let it go, just let it go naturally, because mind you, I had jet black hair, right? When I was born, I was bald until I was 18 months, my poor mother, and I looked like this poor kid, you know, on the mission. And then when it came, it was snow white. And then the older that as I grew, it got darker. And now when I let it go grey, my grandkids say Nin, you know, because in my language, grandmother is Ninny. They call me Nina. And, you know, you want to get your hair fixed. So just that's one thing that I can tolerate the other, you know, all the other aches and pains and the difficulties of not being able to walk too fast. But what I want to share with you is the beauty of, in my culture, is that the young ones, the grandchildren and grandnieces and nephews and children, they look after. They look after. They protect. Because that is their cultural obligation. And they have to, whether they like it or not, have to respect. If somebody breaches that in our family and our culture, then those young ones are certainly held to account. So, I mean, I know the world changes and there's certain influence that certainly impact. But I've got to say that I enjoy being older. I don't like the aches and pains, but and having to get my hair dyed, you know, every few weeks. But it is wonderful to share my life experience with my grandchildren and grandnieces and nephews, because, you know, they're the future, and they certainly look out and look after us. So, you know, one thing that I ask when I get to do welcomes is for people just for a moment to remember our loved ones that have passed over before us, the incredible giants that have allowed each and every one of us to stand on their shoulders, the beautiful people that are sitting beside you and standing beside you now, and those gorgeous, precious ones that follow in our footstep. So may my people spirit walk and guide all of us as we continue on that journey together, and let that journey be one where we can collectively all work together to address issues that impact on people within our respective communities. So once again, welcome to the land of the Eora Nation. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and may your symposium be deadly as everybody that's in the room. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Auntie Anne, and we have a gift for you from Diana. I'd like to introduce now Margaret Duckett, who is the new chair of Seniors' Rights Service. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you. Thank you, Russell, for helping me up. Getting a little bit older, I fell over a few weeks ago, and I now have a damaged Achilles tendon and a broken coccyx. So I'm a little unsteady on my feet, and I didn't think to bring a walking stick or anything, so I needed to have a human walking stick. So thanks, Russell. I'd like to personally also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I think it's an important start to any gathering to, if you like, challenge ageism and acknowledge that elders play a really important role in all our lives, our whole lives. And it's something I think the entire community of Australia should learn and benefit from. With this symposium today, a 2016 report found that 500,000 older Australian women are living in long-term income poverty. Ageing exacerbates difference in advantage over a whole life. Factors such as pay gaps, experience of domestic violence and basic sexism mean that women have many more barriers than men in achieving a comfortable old age. Our symposium this morning is set in two sections. The first is a range of speakers documenting particular problems in subgroups of women. And then the second section is talking about changes that could be made, that should be made to try and ameliorate those disadvantages. I hope you all enjoy it. I hope it's instructive and educational, and I hope we all have fun as well in our discussions and our breaks at morning tea and lunchtime. Look forward to talking with all of you later. Bye.
Well, what a wonderful beginning to a day. Getting out of the car or the bus or the train and making it in one piece was pretty good, but that's even better. I'm going to invite the members of our first forum to come and join me on the stage. You'll see Dr. Catherine Lambert. Is she moving? Yes. Hello, can you hear me, Catherine? Oh, we're wondering if that's a still photo of you, who is on the screen, defeated by the weather. She's the founder and director of the Opal Institute and coordinator of the Power Project. And if I can get the other members of the panel to come join me on the stage. Just coming up here is Professor Deborah Loxton, co-director, Research Centre for Generational Health and Ageing, Deputy Director of the Australian Longitudinal Study on Women's Health at the University of Newcastle. So welcome to Deborah. She's sitting in the middle of the room. Make her feel welcome. To her left is Kimberly Olsen, who's the founder and CEO of Trans Employment Program Australia. Welcome, Kimberly. Moving along to the left, Sarah Lambert, who's the Director of the Community Health and Regional Services at ACON. Welcome, Sarah. Terry Leolius, who has triumphed over the traffic, who is the Project Manager of Ethnic Communities Council of New South Wales. Hi, Terry. And moving back towards me in a wonderful green, Barbara O'Neill, Aboriginal support worker at the Junction Neighbourhood Centre at Maroubra. Hi, Barbara. And just on my left is Leslie Robson, who's with Baptist Care, and she's with their Housing and Retirement Living Division. So welcome to Leslie. So because Catherine's the odd woman out, we thought we might start with Catherine. We'll invite each of our panellists to talk just for about 4 or 5 minutes on their answer to the question, what's happening now and what are the issues? And we'll start with Dr. Catherine Barrett.
Thanks, Ellen. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you all this morning, and I'm sorry that I couldn't share with you. I wanted to start by sharing with you a picture of very gorgeous Margarita Solis, the 96-year-old woman that I've been working with. So if you could imagine Margarita's face rather than mine, that would make me happy. Margarita, so the work that I do actually, I need to let you know, the work that I do is around preventing sexual abuse of older women, and that's work I've been doing for the last 6 years. And Margarita is a 96-year-old woman who was 94 when she was sexually abused by the acting manager of a seniors rental service that she lived in. When Margarita reported the sexual abuse to the manager of that service, she was told, you must have a urinary tract infection. That could not have possibly happened. He is a friend of ours. And when Margarita and another woman in that service who was also sexually abused took the case to court, the perpetrator's wife wrote a letter to the court and had a problem with the evidence of the sexually prosecuted. And the perpetrator was actually given a deeply good behaviour. And the reason that I shared that story with Margarita is because there will be many parallels with other people in the panel this morning around the factors that disadvantage older women and make older women vulnerable to abuse. And there will be many that will be shared, which are around isolation and frailty in particular. But the one I want to talk about is around our attitudes. And if we could transform our attitudes, we would prevent sexual abuse of older women. So ageism and sexism are real factors that create disadvantage for older women who experience sexual abuse. And I want to share with you just a really quick example of how that happens. One in ResCare, one at home. And in ResCare, for the last 6 years, we've been collecting data on alleged unlawful contact. So sexual abuse in residential care. And every year there are between 370 and 440 reports of unlawful sexual contact by a person who is not cognitively impaired. So if the alleged perpetrator is not cognitively impaired, it might be reported. So that data has been collected for 6 years, and to the best of my knowledge, we have done absolutely nothing with that data. We are collecting it, but we are not using that data to develop education programs, to inform research, to inform policy, to prevent sexual abuse of older women. And what is that if that is not ageism? I mean, how do we collect data on sexual abuse of older women and do nothing with it? I just think it's a big shame job, actually. I think it's dreadful. And I want to know how is it that we have 370 to 440 reports a year from people who are not cognitively impaired? How is it that perpetrators who are not cognitively impaired are sexually abusing older women? I mean, this is a real problem, and I think we are doing very little, if nothing about it. And what about at home? Well, I think at home we have a real problem around family violence, and we know that 1 in 5 women in Australia have experienced sexual violence. So that means around 400,000 older women have experienced sexual violence. And why do we think that it stops at age 65? Why do we think that older men wake up on their 65th birthday and go, well, that's it, I'm not going to do that anymore? That's not the way it happens. There's been a power imbalance. We've had marital rape immunity laws, and that set the scene. And sexual abuse does happen. We know that from research projects that I've been involved in, Norma's project and other research reports. But yet, with our strategies for preventing elder abuse, we often talk about financial abuse as being the most common form of elder abuse, but we don't know that it is actually. We know that it's the most commonly reported form of elder abuse, but there is so much shame and silencing that happens around sexual abuse that it's not being reported. And Margarita, in my 15 years of working around sexual abuse and older women, Margarita is the first woman that I have ever heard and has been prepared to tell her story publicly. And that does not mean that sexual abuse of older women is uncommon. It means we've got a real problem with our culture and not listening, and that's what places women at disadvantage. I can't be there this afternoon for policy and research, but I am urging and imploring you to please consider putting sexual abuse on the agenda. Our silence, there are very few students who think that it is their responsibility to prevent the sexual abuse of older women, and that places older women at disadvantage. So my invitation to you is please consider doing something. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks so much, Catherine. That was terrific. If you want to look up Margarita's story, she did tell that story to the Weekend Australian. She was a very isolated woman. Her husband had passed away. Her son, I think at the age of 70, was suffering with Alzheimer's. So she was and she was not believed the first couple of times she reported what had happened until she went along to a social club that she was a part of, and she was certainly believed there, and she pursued it through the courts. But you can also see the amount of determination that took to get a result. Sarah, if I can invite you to speak next. So Sarah, again, is the Director of Community Health and Regional Services at ACON.
Wow, privileged to go next.
If you just bend that microphone, there you are.
Can we hear now? No? Got it?
Yeah, it's there.
Hello?
If we just turn that mark up a fraction, bend that one up. Keep talking, just
Hello?
count. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Are we okay? Hello?
There you are. I think let's begin and we'll see what we can do as we go along. Yes. They're both turned off though. We thought the technical difficulty was going to be with the video from Melbourne. Little did we realise.
Hello?
There we are.
Excellent. All right. I'm from ACON, which is an LGBTI health organisation, and I understand the conversations, particularly around the pointy end of disadvantage and vulnerability, previously had been around elder abuse. I'd like to just paint a picture of what it's like for LBQ women. I understand I've got a colleague here who's going to particularly talk about the trans experience, so I won't go into that as much detail. We're seeing the first generation of women ageing out and proud, and that's a remarkable thing. We've seen the 40-year anniversary of Mardi Gras, with the 78ers being our elders who have led the way for us and our rights. But we do have a generation of women for whom this is a first. It's the first time they're accessing aged care services. It's the first time that they're often having conversations amongst peers where they're leading the trail around ageism and homophobia within LGBTI communities, but also broader society. And what we see when we see elder abuse for this community, we see fear of disclosing their sexuality and gender. We see potential denying of visitors within aged care facilities and within the homes by carers and significant others. We see threats to evict, to out non-consensually, and to withhold the displaying of cultural significant items, whether that's the good old rainbow flags or significant family pictures and things. But why is this the case? I think the fact that it's the first generation coming through is part of what happens. And we are, as a community, do face social isolation, and this is for a number of reasons. One is minority stress, which is the cumulative experience of discrimination and denial of rights, but also invisibility. We also see intersections where people from culturally and linguistic backgrounds, Aboriginal, and people who are particularly trans and gender diverse have the multiple experiences that come into this. We see our communities having housing stress and financial difficulties, and that's often around gender pay gaps and superannuation and barriers to employment that have happened across the lifespan. We're also seeing this generation entering aged care services and being very nervous to do so. We have 2 wonderful programs at ACON which focus on love. I'm going to draw on the work of those amazing staff, Russ from the Love Project, Living Older Visibly Engaged, and our Community Visitor Scheme. Both those programs help and support our communities entering aged care services where they're afraid of being their authentic selves, and some people actually go back into the closet. Or if they're letting home care services come into the home, they almost de-gay their home to make it safe. They may keep up the separate bedroom for their partners, and so it's a housemate and not a partner. And all these things really eat away at the core of them as individuals and their abilities to live that life engaged and visibly and vibrant. And that impacts on mental health, it impacts on health and wellbeing, all facets of life. We're also aware that for our communities, there is often perhaps the potential of estrangement from family or fewer biological family connections to help and support through the ageing process. For our communities, chosen families are core. And when we're doing things like needing to move into aged care facilities or needing to move out of the residential areas such as the inner west where we feel safe, secure and connected to LGBTI communities, it means we lose those valuable connections and supports. I've got a colleague who's going to talk about training of aged care services, but I'd say that's one of the things our community is so thankful for, is to have Silver Rainbow training for aged care providers that actually resources aged care workers on how do you support our communities and how do you make it a non-judgmental space. I'd also say that our Love Project, what comes across the most for our communities is we want to feel connected. LGBTI events and spaces often aren't as welcoming as of our elders and older people as what we'd like. They're often really focused on youth cultures. And we want to have spaces and things that we can do where we connect with one another. And so things like the Seniors Week, Afternoon Delights movie matinees, and Love Lines, our art exhibition and activities, and Love Club are really crucial for that. So I guess underpinning a lot of what I've just spoken about is that ability to live visibly and to be connected and to be celebrated is really crucial for healthy ageing and to combat some of the disadvantage that our women in our communities experience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. And for drawing that connection into, the second panel that we're going to have after morning tea, talking about what policies and research. Everybody's very much read the brief, and to give experiences that throw forward to that discussion. Terry, we might hear from you next. Terry Leolius is, again, Project Manager with the Ethnic Communities Council of New South Wales.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. Yes, Terry Leolius. I actually manage the Speak My Language program funded by the Department of Health and Ageing. And the program looks at utilising ethnic media and ethnic radio to discuss many aged care issues that we have amongst our communities. We have 14 topics, including dementia and future planning and my aged care and having confidence in yourself. And there are so many topics that we talk about. And one of the hardest topics that we find, and one of the most challenging that we have to talk about on ethnic radio, is elder abuse. Mm-hmm. There's so many different issues around having that discussion on air, and even off air before we even get on air. For many of our very brave bilingual facilitators, quite often they say to me before they even begin the program, we are afraid of the reprimand that we will receive to even have this discussion and assume on ethnic radio in our own language with our community groups that it even exists. So for some of them, they've actually said to me during training, look, we've actually been stopped at shopping centres and been told, stop that. Stop having these conversations. You're embarrassing our entire community all over the country by even assuming that elder abuse happens in our communities. So we're up against a bit of a hill, but we have such incredibly brave bilingual facilitators that are tackling this. Part of the program is also to engage champions in our communities, to actually engage with our bilingual facilitators on air and then take the conversation back to the community. And for many of our champions, they're actually experiencing that as well. And they don't have the skill set and they don't have the training that bilingual aged care workers have, or the thick skin to be able to respond to some of those community conversations. For us, it's around making the community accountable, making the community aware, and having everyone aware about what this topic is, that it exists, and breaking down those concepts in the different languages, in the different language groups, and the different community groups as well. And elder abuse appears and presents itself and is defined very differently across the board amongst all our ethnic community groups. And our tackle and our examples that we give on radio really need to be specific to our ethnic community groups. For us, it's around taking it out there and actually starting that conversation. It's around defining elder abuse but allowing them to define it. It's around giving permission for people to have that discussion on air, call in the radio station and have a discussion. For many of our ethnic groups, it takes a long time to allow them to have a conversation or own up to a comment that they have. Many of them want to be anonymous, which means that it's very hard when you don't have people that want to stand up and say, I want to talk about this, I want to be open about this. The taboos around elder abuse, obviously in our ethnic communities, are significant. Elder abuse is something that they not only do not talk about, but believe it doesn't exist. And to even speak up about it, or actually say this is happening in my family, or actually, bring up to the point that saying to somebody else in your community, my family is doing this, is a complete taboo, let alone actually the abuse itself. So therefore there's that hidden mat that we have over everyone that says, we're not going to talk about it because it doesn't exist. So for many of us, it's around with Speak My Language, putting it out there, having those conversations and encouraging people to start breaking down those concepts. For many of us in our CARD communities, travelling to Australia, coming to Australia and settling to Australia means the family unit has changed. And previously, our family unit allowed those kind of supports. And if you go to many other countries, you'll probably find that the family unit protects itself, the community protects the elder. And in many community groups, the elder is very much respected and a very important part of that community. They are not left out or left on the side. They're actually an important foundation in delivering information and culture and continuing the traditions. We find once they settle in another country, or a Western country, children move on. They may not live in the same suburb or street or even city or even state. And that family unit breaks down and suddenly that role of the elder has changed. And with that comes the respect that they normally would have, the fact that they would not be called upon to look after grandchildren or have that traditional role where they are very much respected. I don't know if you remember last time I was talking with the last webinar about the blue zones. And there's particular areas or countries or places around the world, 6 or 7 places around the world, where people live as centurions, the largest number of centurions, people living over 100. And they don't just live, they live very well. Very low health conditions, very high health conditions, I should say, low heart attacks, not much diabetes. They don't have a lot of the risk factors that they have. But one of the things that they did find in those areas is the respect that elders have in this community and the fact that they play such an important role, and issues such as elder abuse would not even be considered, or they would be tackled very quickly by the community or the extended community as well. For many of us with women, many of our women who have come to this country have very little English. They weren't educated in their own country, came from war-torn countries and therefore are here with limited language in their own language. So delivering that information for elder abuse for us is a very big challenge. For many of them, they worked in factories where they didn't have their rights here in this country. I've got to move it on very quickly, do I?
If you can.
Yes. They've been pretty much organised into believing that you have a certain level of financial, not freedom, but financial support, a certain amount of work conditions, a certain amount of things that you can say and do, a certain amount of confidence that you can have to back yourself up in those areas. So when we're talking about elder abuse, you're talking about years of a background of showing people that you don't really have the right to say very much. So when it comes up, you're challenged much more than just elder abuse definitions, but you're talking about the people who have been taught and told you don't have a voice. So we're up against quite a few challenges there, but I'll talk a little bit about it more later.
Wonderful, Terry. Thank you for that overview. Yeah, making the community accountable and the right to have a voice. There's some interesting themes coming out through all of this. Kimberly Olsen, can I turn to you next, founder and CEO of Trans Employment Program Australia. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very honoured to be speaking here. And I'd first of all like to acknowledge Auntie Anne speaking earlier and how important it is now in our culture to acknowledge the first Australians and the connection between that and the conversations that we're having today. I was fortunate enough to spend a great deal of time in Indigenous communities and to have them teach me some of their language, and so I do speak a little Pitjantjatjara. And so one of the things that I would like to say is Nanananyuntu Kanyani Kanyani Panara, which is my best attempt at whoever you are, be proud. And I think the threads that run through all of this is what was spoken about earlier, is that ageing exacerbates various levels of disadvantage. And Sarah mentioned, intersectionality, and for the trans community, intersectionality plays out in very specific ways that impact us across our lifetime, at least post-transition and to some extent prior to transition. So I'd like to speak, a little bit about that and what that means. And I'll use my own life story very briefly because I've only got a few minutes to highlight some of that. I'd known that I was trans from a very young age and pushed that aside, and it wasn't until I got to about my 40s that became a significant issue for me and affected my mental health to the extent that my very successful business was lost, and I lost 2 homes, a marriage, my own personal wealth, and came to Sydney with $400 in 2015 and worked at Acon. And so from, to go from that experience to where I found myself in Sydney is very disempowering. And I could say it's common thread across all of the trans community, no matter when you transition, is that you pay a very high price for that transition. And that price is in disadvantage, particularly in the workplace. Prior to getting that job at Acon, I applied for 128 jobs. I received 7 replies, 4 of them saying things like, "We don't employ people like you." And so, that's why I started up the Trans Employment Program as soon as I had the opportunity to do that. And I think one of the things that we have to recognise that if we haven't lived the experience, we probably can't understand it. And it's very important, therefore, that we ask for representation from those respective communities to tell us about their disadvantage, to learn from their disadvantage. So I guess, in summary, what happens to people from the trans community as we age is we've, for myself, for example, paid a very high price at the time of my transition. I'm not in a good place now at 57 years of age. I'm in a good place personally. I love my life now and I have a fabulous job. I actually do work in the ageing space as well, in designing emergent practice for aged care, as well as running the Trans Employment Program. So I do understand the issues for the ageing community. But financially, I will be one of those people who isn't in a good place when I come to the age when people are no longer willing to employ me. And I think, I see with all the people that I'm assisting through the Trans Employment Program, real barriers to employment, and therefore real barriers to income, real barriers to lifelong security. And, ours plays out for all women. That means that we're significantly disadvantaged at the point that we find ourselves requiring aged care services.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sharing your story too. That was very generous of you. Can I turn to Barbara O'Neill? Again, Barbara's an Aboriginal support worker in Maroubra at the Junction Neighbourhood Centre. We're all pretty confident this mic works, aren't we? We're going to stick with this mic, yeah. No, keep talking. I love listening to you talk. Yes, I will.
Hi, thank you for having me here today, and thank you, Anne, is she still here, for that wonderful welcome. I'm privileged as an Aboriginal woman to work with Aboriginal women, and especially young women. Because it is so natural in our culture to respect older people, I am one of those really lucky women that these young women are dealing with DV, poverty, but they still say, "Hey, Auntie Barb, you're rocking your grey." Like they participate in my life. I'm not there and they're not here. Having said that, in the Aboriginal culture, respect for older people and elders is tantamount. It goes with the territory. But that has been torn asunder for us through poverty and unconscious bias, because our younger people are dealing with just survival and trying to work. Aboriginal people have always worked, we just didn't get paid. So we have a young cohort now feeling the pushback and the unconscious bias of not being able to achieve access to the economy. So that downplays to our older people, because what happens is anyone that gets pushed around enough, the wheels fall off their life. And so therefore there are children that are born. And these young mums and dads trying to then move ahead have to rely on those older people to help them with the children. That's fine, that's great, it happens to everyone. But our communities are so ravaged with drugs and also the generational poverty brought on by colonisation that our older people are minding children, they've got them in kin care, while the younger people are incarcerated. So our older people, I see this as a form of abuse. that's caused through generational behaviour and colonisation, because they are now looking after the younger ones. Aboriginal people have a history of poor health because of colonisation. So we have sick older people looking after younger people, trying to keep them in school, trying to give them the best start in life that they can. We also have the issue of our older people who their own children are either imprisoned or on drugs. Like any normal adult parent, they look back and say, what did I do? They never, ever, ever say, oh, look what colonisation did. They never go there. They internalise this pain and take on responsibility that they must have done something wrong. So how do we get older people with that mindset and with that lived experience to go to a service, especially a non-Aboriginal service? Because unconscious bias is evident. Once you've lived an Aboriginal life, the unconscious bias is something it's like it's going to rain today. We were warned it's going to rain. So an Aboriginal person goes into a service. Oh yes, there's going to be unconscious bias, but it's not articulated like that. It's like, I'm going to go into this service and I'm going to have to struggle just to get through the door and talk to somebody. So I work mainly from a trauma perspective, and when I speak to older people, I speak to older people on the La Perouse mission, and they have quite... I don't work with them as from the mission perspective, that's Land Council business, but when I do speak to them socially, they have the problems that other Aboriginal grandparents have, but they have their home, they have their land, they're living on their country. That goes so far towards their strength and resilience. But I also work with older women that through DV, poverty, disconnection, they have been told to move down to Maroubra, Matraville, Malabar, that whole Randwick LGA, where we have quite a few housing estates. So we have older women that have been disconnected from everything so that they are safe and away from the rural area which they usually come from. And they are living in units. And by the time they get to me, it's almost like, yeah, well, what do I expect? I deserve this. Look, I lived with the DV for so long, it finally forced me out. They take on the responsibility of that predator. And this is one of the things that, it's not elder abuse that you see in the mainstream community. It's elder abuse caused by the system. It's elder abuse caused by generational disconnection and colonisation. I will always point the finger at colonisation because we have not addressed that yet. We have not addressed the fallout from colonisation. So our older people, there is a black working class, but for a lot of those older people, the black working class was crushed until the 70s or 80s. The black working class was absolutely ignored or was not allowed to exist. So we've got older people that worked all their lives. And then as they got older, well, like all of us, it's really hard to get a job. But what's happened with them is they can't talk. They can't talk about, yes, I worked. Yes, I did this, I did that. Because it was never recognised that they were workers.
Right.
You're Aboriginal. You're not a worker, you can't be a worker. So we have this psychology with our older people now, some of them, not all of them, but like Auntie Anne, she's strong. She's got her family, she's got her country, she's really strongly connected. But we have other women that won't even admit their Aboriginality because it brings down so much upon their heads.
Yeah, right.
And without that connection to who they are, they're just going to get sicker and sicker and sicker. And that's the elder abuse that I identify within the Aboriginal community I work in.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. All sorts of echoes, aren't there, across the different stories? Sarah talking about living visibly, and that last point you were making, Barbara, about living an authentic life, and the notion that presented to us of, if you're respected, you have better health outcomes. You know, what is it that makes these people in certain communities live to 100, and isn't that an interesting possibility? Professor Deborah Loxton, I'll invite to speak next, and I think, Deborah, you wanted to start by talking about, in answer to Kath's question about we've got all this data and we do nothing with it. Well, you've got 22 years of data of the Women's Health Australia, the longitudinal study with 57,000 women involved. Start by telling us about that and then maybe answer the question.
Yeah. So it's been my privilege for the last 15 years to work on the Australian longitudinal study on women's health, and we do indeed have 57,000 Australian women who participate in this study. They're in 4 age groups. The youngest group's in their late 20s, with a group who are aged 40 to 45, another who are in their late 60s and early 70s, and our oldest group are in their mid-90s. So we have a plethora of data collected from these women, and they've told us about their lives, they've told us about their experiences of abuse from the time they were children. So we know if they've experienced childhood abuse, we know if they've experienced abuse in adulthood, and we know if they've experienced abuse in older adulthood. I'll address the question first, and then I might give a few examples of what's happening for women in Australia, particularly around middle age and as they age from that point on. What we do with our data is inform policy, primarily with the Department of Health. Professor Biles is here, and she'll be talking about policy a bit more this afternoon in the second panel. But I do want to reassure you that the information that we collect is used and is paid attention, and attention is paid to it. But I think we can always do more, and we can always do more to advocate for women's health and to understand the impact of violence and abuse across the life course. So I wanted to talk about 2 groups of women today: women who experience relationship breakdown of one sort or another, and women who experience abuse at any point across the life course. For women who experience divorce or separation, we know from our data that they go on to experience economic stress, and that related to that is poorer health for many, many years, and potentially their lifetime related to that divorce and separation. I interviewed women some years ago, and I remember the words of one woman so clearly, and she said, "Divorce just tears your wealth down." Women don't fight as well as they potentially could with support during property settlement phases, and particularly if there's domestic violence involved. They don't always get access to superannuation in a way that they should be entitled to, and this does not set them up well as they get into middle age and older age. This is further complicated when women have a period of sole motherhood. And I was really, my first job out after I got my doctorate was interviewing sole mothers. And it was astounding to me how much these women lost through the property settlement and divorce process. So many of them were struggling with finances that we found when we looked at the population level data that they were actually greatly stressed. They were carrying an enormous mental health burden, and they were much more likely to be doing things like self-harming and having suicidal thoughts. And a good proportion of these outcomes were related to the fact that they were living with huge financial stress. At that time, I think it was about 14 years ago, there was $6.9 billion worth of child support debt sitting in the Child Support Agency offices. And still I don't see much movement in that area towards getting a fair deal for supporting parents and for making people pay child support for their children that are living with another parent. These are things that I'm quite passionate about personally, having had a period of my own sole parenthood, so I will admit that bias up front, but we see it quite clearly in our data. Women who are sole parents are much more likely to be renting houses and to not be paying off a mortgage or to own a property. Around about 11% of women generally in the ages 40 to 45 will own or be paying off a property. 43% of sole mothers are in rental accommodation. This is not setting them up well economically for when they get to retirement age. When we look at our group, if there is such a thing as retirement, when we look at our group of women who are in their late 60s and early 70s, those who are divorced or separated are much more likely to still be in the paid workforce at a full-time level. And while that might be a good choice to make, the evidence that we have for their financial stress indicates that this is not really a choice at all. They are also around about 40% of them in rental accommodation and not living in permanent or stable housing. Of course, as they move onto a fixed income, the rental market is not going to stay pegged to their fixed income. And even though there is rent assistance, it just doesn't cover it. When we look at women who've experienced abuse, either in childhood or adulthood, we see that there's a lifetime impact of abuse for women's health and well-being. So in a paper that we published last year, we managed to show 16 years after abuse had ceased, we are still seeing a deficit in mental and physical health for women who've experienced domestic violence. This year we did some work having a look at the impact of abuse experienced in childhood and found very similar results. A lifetime impact, a lifetime health deficit attributable to abuse experienced 20, 30, 40 years ago. We look at our elder abuse statistics and find 1/3 of women aged in their late 60s and early 70s have reported at least one incident of elder abuse, be it coercion, theft, or being afraid of someone in their family. Sometimes, as people have mentioned today, this is a carry-on of behaviour that has been happening across the entire life course. For other women, it's something new that just starts happening as they become older. We know from our work with the women who are now in their mid-90s that those who experienced elder abuse in their 70s were more likely to die at a younger age and were more likely to experience disability as they got older. So the question is, what can we do about this? I think your second panel this afternoon is going to answer some of those questions. But just like the longitudinal study highlights for us where some of these problems are, it can also offer clues to what we can do about it. Invariably, women who have good social support around them, and this is echoing things that everybody said this morning, do better than the women who don't have good social support. Of course, we also know that women who've lived with domestic violence are much less likely to have social support because isolation forms part of that abuse constellation. So I was going to try and leave you on a high note, but I seem to have come back to the low again. But I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deb. We'll come to Leslie Robson now, but it's interesting the way in which today's program has been put together. That Professor Julie Biles is going to be speaking a little bit later. She's from the same. She's from the University of Newcastle as well, the director of the research centre there of generational health and ageing. But to think about that, there are these touch points that you've identified that are, well known to everybody else on the panel from their life's work, that you can point at in the data and say, renting, sole parent, early 40s, dangerous time, lifelong impacts of abuse from childhood. You don't recover if there's no intervention for 16 years, I think afterwards was the statistic that you came up with. All right, so we'll come to Leslie Robson now, and Leslie works with Baptist Care. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I work for Baptist Care, but I primarily work with those who are homeless and mainly women who have experienced domestic violence. Baptist Care is a community housing provider and they do have seniors housing. It's designed for ageing in the home, it's permanent. They have 200 of those currently and are in the process of building 500 more across New South Wales. All of them come with wraparound services. And they're funded under the government from the SAF program. The SAF program is going to eventually have just over 3,000 new properties over the next 3 or 4 years. However, we have 150,000 people on the social housing waiting list and there's been 3,000 built. The policies have been that over the last 10, 15 years, we've been demolishing and reducing social housing and not building to keep up with the needs. It is identified that single women over 55 are one of the highest needs for housing, social housing. They're the fastest growing rate of homeless. There's a big push for everyone to go into private rental, but we all know Sydney. It's pretty expensive to live in Sydney. Now, we also have transitional housing, and I'll just give you an example of a woman who's been with us for 11 months. 55, came from DV, left after the children grew up and left home, which is quite common. Has worked casually throughout her life, but has absolutely no savings, no super, no nothing. Is unable to work because of that trauma and is really anxiety, depression. Work is just not an option at the moment. So she's got $300, just under $300 a week to live on. And she's told she's got to go out and find private rental. Now, government believes you halve your weekly amount and spend that on rent. Now, we will be told by everyone that that means immediate poverty. So she has half her income. She'll get some Commonwealth rent assistance, and because of the Start Safely, domestic violence, she will get Start Safely. But the women who, come to us homeless for other reasons, lost a job, sickness, they won't get Start Safely. So she's got to find somewhere to live for $200 a week. She has no choice. I mean, she'll be limited to some grotty bedsit or boarding house, and that's what she's expected to live in. Her work capacity by the time she's too old to work is pretty limited, maybe a bit of casual work. Start Safely will run out in 3 years. She'll be homeless again. And then also the health. It costs the nation billions of dollars in health for the homeless. So why are we not doing something that promotes them being in safe, stable, affordable accommodation? Housing's a basic right. And you do have to, like, if you look at whoever's come, whatever reason they've become homeless, there will be grief and trauma. They have lost their family. They might have adult children, but they're often estranged because that's been part of the domestic violence. So the big issue is our government is not, does not have the right housing policies. Mm-hmm. They're not looking at the housing needs of the most vulnerable. Our affordable private market needs to be looked at as well. We do, in our next 500 houses being built, I'm really happy to say Baptist Care has that wraparound service. We will take 500 people off the waiting list who are seniors who need housing desperately, but we'll be leaving another 145,000 on that list. Thank you.
So there's some meaty subjects there for the policy and research discussion to follow, from housing to consumer-centred care, which is a really interesting challenge, isn't it? Because government talks about consumer-centred care a lot without a recognition of that means an acceptance of who the person is and an honouring of who that person is within the services and not the other way around. So there's a lot there. Please thank the members of the panel very much for that flying start. I'll invite you to morning tea now, but as the members of the panel leave the panel here, Diana has a gift for each of you. I'll hand over to Russell.
And I just wanted to make a quick announcement that for morning tea, we're going to very much stick to the 15 minutes because we are running over. There's 2 coffee stations, one outside the store and one sort of at the back of the auditorium area, and the toilets are in sort of that direction by that coffee station. But again, sticking to 15 minutes, so probably 5 after 11. Thanks.
I'm going to invite the members of that panel, Jodie Broun, Professor Julie Biles, Angela Budai, Sam Edmonds, Catherine McKernan. Terry Leolius is standing in for Mary Patetsos, who can't be with us from Adelaide due to the weather, and Susan Ryan is our final panellist this morning. So do we have nearly all of our panellists on the stage? We are going to have a discussion for about 40 minutes, say, and then we want to come to your questions. There are any number of people watching us online and they can submit their questions. I think there's information probably right above my head, just there, that tells you how to email us a question or send us a question. And for anyone who wants to use Twitter to reflect what's happening here, you can use the hashtag #WomenAging, hashtag #WomenAging. And so, look, maybe we'll start. I mean, Jodie Broun, I'll introduce everybody, give a wave as I do so. Jodie Broun is written here as the Director of the Red Cross New South Wales. She's in fact the former Director of the Red Cross New South Wales and former co-chairperson of the National Congress of Australia's First People, and she's got a new job which is at the New South Wales Aboriginal Housing Office. So she can speak to us from a range of perspectives. Give her a big warm welcome. Who else is talking on ageing? Wave your hand. Yeah, okay. Terry wants to talk on ageing, so say hi to Terry again, and a big thank you for stepping in for Mary. So there are two folks who can talk around issues of ageing, and also so can Professor Julie Biles. Julie is the director, director of the Research Centre for Generational Health and Ageing at the University of Newcastle, and she works with Professor Deb Loxton, who was on our earlier panel. So give her a warm welcome. So we've got three people there who can talk broadly on the issues of ageing. Angela Budai is the National Women's Officer and National Industrial Officer at the Finance Sector Union of Australia. And so she is going to talk about older women's finances and the events throughout their lives that might have a cumulative effect of resulting in disadvantage as they age. So big welcome for Angela. Sam Edmonds, Silver Rainbow, National Project Manager, National LGBTI Health Alliance. And Sam, am I right in thinking, is there a microphone anywhere near you?
Sort of vaguely.
There you are. That you're serving on a committee that is advising, diversity committee, advising government on issues of ageing.
Issues of ageing, but diversity in aged care.
Okay, diversity in aged care. So that's sort of another hat that you wear. Welcome, Sam. Who have I left out? Susan Ryan, former Age Discrimination Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission, who is still very much involved in all issues to do with ageing and women's issues. Welcome, Susan. Who have I left out on the panel? Me. Hello, Catherine. We haven't met, that's why. Catherine McKernan, Executive Officer, Homelessness, New South Wales. Welcome to you. And please welcome her. So why don't we invite the people who wear a hat of housing to talk around the issue of what policies and research do we need to change the dynamic around housing, secure housing for older women, which is one of the key indicators that comes up, indeed, in the news coverage always, of the disadvantage suffered by Australian women as they age. Who wants to start there?
I can, but I'm sure Susan and Jodie can jump in at any point as well. I think the first point that I'd like to make is that...
Okay, so we need to be a bit louder. And what happened to our lovely handheld mics that we were so confident of? They're there, are they?
They're roving for questions, I think. So
no, that's okay. We can.
Is that all right?
That's
can you hear
terrific.
me?
Yep.
Okay, I'll just speak really closely. So the first thing I wanted to say is that we've had a lot of focus on the issue of affordable housing and housing affordability, and also quite a bit recently on older women and homelessness. And I think the panel before us actually really identified a lot of the issues and as to why it's happening. We're really focused at the moment on trying to demonstrate that we have the evidence, we know what works, and it's actually quite simple. What we need is affordable housing, we need much more social housing, and we need affordable private rentals. And we also need a private rental market that enables people to live long-term in a home so that they're not having to worry about where they might need to move to. We also need to look at the different kinds of housing models that older women might need, and that all in the context of having affordable housing. So looking at, what size housing people need, what kind of community they need to be living in, how can they access services to help them age in place, and then if people do need to move into aged care, how do we actually help that transition to occur? So I'm working with a lot of other housing and homelessness services at the moment on the Everybody's Home campaign, and that campaign is really focused on saying that we do know what the solution is, and the solution is actually a significant investment in social housing. We're saying 500,000 homes, social and affordable housing homes over the next 10 years across Australia. We need that, and then we need the policies and platforms put in place to actually enable older women to access that housing. So, for example, in New South Wales, you can only get priority housing if you're aged over 80. Those sorts of things.
You can only get what sort of housing?
You only get priority housed within social housing if you're over 80. And if you're Aboriginal, it's 55. I think it's 50, 55. Yeah, I think it's 55 if you're Aboriginal. Is that right? Yeah, 55. So there's things like that also need to change. And so, but the biggest message is we need investment in social housing. We need action to make housing more affordable, and then we need to look at how do we make that increase in affordable housing appropriate and accessible for older women.
All right, and Jodie, should we turn to you, keeping in mind that you have been in the job 48 hours?
Yes.
But you have a lifetime of experience of thinking about human-centred design and
right.
culturally safe services.
Yeah, and so I'm not speaking, I suppose, from a housing perspective, although one of the last things I did when I was in Red Cross was lead for us on what's called the Constellation Project, which is to end homelessness in a generation, working in partnership with some other organisations and PwC being one of those. And one of the cohorts that we're particularly focusing on was older women. So that's just an adjunct, I suppose. But firstly, if I can say Wandua and acknowledge the Gadigal people whose land we're on and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room. I suppose my background is mostly in Aboriginal affairs and then the last 4.5 years in Red Cross. And so issues around elders particularly have come up in all of those roles, and including when I was with Congress leading work on the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan. So as I said, on Monday started in a chief executive role at Aboriginal Housing in New South Wales, and obviously a big part of that is meeting the needs of elders and communities, elders in our communities, and recognising those sort of compounded issues around health and stolen generations. And I do understand that they have, for Aboriginal housing stock, there is priority given to members of stolen generation. So I think that points to that as a priority group as well. I will speak about elder abuse in that broader context of rights and racism, and I think, to me, that is the context that we need to come from. We know that disadvantage and chronic disease impacts really significantly on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, and elders in the system much earlier and suffering those diseases much earlier because of that sort of background and historical poverty and disadvantage. But I think we've also got to look at what healthy ageing looks like for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that is one area where I think there's not enough research, and in fact I was able to find some but not enough, and even that research called for more research. So it is an area I think that we tend to also always go into deficit, deficit language and deficit services, and yet we should be doing more strength-based approaches for our elders. So there was a Association of Gerontology Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Group convened last year, in November last year, and that was really about how do we assure equity of access and quality of outcomes for older Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And that identified barriers and key issues and suggestions, which I've drawn on, but I've also got obviously a lot of experience from heading up Aboriginal affairs in New South Wales and Aboriginal housing in WA. So it's, this is a broad sort of background. So what do we think needs to happen? We know women are further impacted not only by poverty and disadvantage, further impacted by abuse and that burden of care. Because they often are, and I think Barbara was talking about that before, the people that are looking after the next generation or looking after their own children who might be affected by various illnesses as well. So they also are burdened by that. And isolation's obviously a problem. Regional and remote locations don't often have those services available to meet the needs of our elders. The consumer-directed care environments compounded those challenges, and vulnerable groups, and we've heard a lot about that this morning, need a lot more support and advocacy to participate fully. And I think there's gaps emerging and will continue to emerge in those regional areas, but also where we see providers competing rather than collaborating. So what needs to happen? I think a lot of our people are going to rely on mainstream services and will, they should always have that choice. And while Aboriginal specific services might be preferred, they're not always available. But I think there's a real lack of cultural understanding and cultural safety and appropriate service being delivered by mainstream services. And I think a lot of what was said in the earlier forum and panel around that sort of denial of culture is a significant abuse of our elders. Racism continues to be an issue, and one thing we might have to look at, I think, is that for a lot of our elders, it's more culturally relevant to have gender-specific services, and that means that the person treating them is also, male, female, depending on the client as well. The workshop last year also identified better education and training of aged care employees and the need for leadership that promotes cultural safety. And so those sorts of elements, I think, are really critical to going forward. And what does that look like in the mainstream? But we really need to hold mainstream services accountable for bringing themselves up to speed. Mm-hmm. Client-centred design or human-centred design, I think we've got to do more of that. And treat our elders as people who can be self-determining, informing them in their careers of their choices and seeking their full consent. Holistic models of care, and I was interested in that sort of wraparound service model, need to be designed. But what we find is it's often neglected, particularly with our own people. And I think there's this whole thing of responding to critical needs, but leaving the person out of that response. In a health sort of environment. Too often we're not engaging, or worse, actively ignoring elders in the design of services to meet their needs or in responses to their care needs. And this is based on assumptions, racism and ignorance, and in some instances arrogance. And that combines to leave elders out of the key decisions concerning the service they need. But as I said, I think we also need to look at what is healthy ageing from a First Nations elders' perspective, and what does that mean for the service system. Another research piece from Coombs and some others, healthy ageing concepts for New South Wales First Nations communities, identified culturally specific community-led healthy ageing programs that are more holistic and tap into the spirituality, knowledge and energy that is strength-based was needed. And so, again, as I said, more research needed in that area. But we also need to bear in mind there's never one size fits all. At these sorts of things, human-centred design has to be done with the communities involved. And lastly, I just wanted to point out we need to do more training and information to support families. Many of our elders actually stay in their homes. They're not actually in aged care facilities. How do we actually support families who are under-resourced and not supported to actually take on that role? And we need to do more to support those carers who are, as I said, more commonly women, such that they can provide holistic care in a family environment that is connected to an accessible and responsive service system. And that's particularly relevant in regional areas where the services are perhaps not available. And I think about one of my family members who was 106 when he passed away. He was living at home up until that time and treated with absolute respect, and carried in and out of the house, allowed to participate in law business. In fact, had to, but also engaged in bush tucker songs, those sorts of things. And one thing that the other research piece was talking about was that our elders do want to continue to practice culture and to enjoy life. So it's that healthy ageing. But how do we make sure that that person is supported and the family are supported to do that? So thank you.
Wonderful. Jodie confessed to me, never tell a journalist anything, Jodie, because then they'll have a microphone in front of them and then they'll tell everybody. But with all of that on your mind, no wonder you're having sleepless nights 2 days into your new job. Julie Burns Biles next, Director of Research. So, I mean, it's interesting what's coming out here. We began with Kath Barrett, didn't we, Julie, saying, gosh darn it, I got the statistics, don't need any more statistics. 370 to 440 unlawful sexual contacts by people not cognitively impaired and and no real response. Why is there no real response around that? Right through to Catherine here at the beginning of this session saying, we know what we need. We need 500,000 more homes, okay, community homes somehow, public housing, or housing that's affordable housing. Jodie's hinting there at some research needed that doesn't focus on a deficit model that says what is healthy, what does healthy look like. So, you know, there you are as the Director of Research. What are you making of all of that?
Okay, so lots, because that's my job. But so first on Catherine Barrett, she said we've got a lot of data, but we're not using the data. And we're not using that data to prevent sexual abuse in older women, and that's because of sexism and ageism. But I think also generally across the board, we have a lot of data and we're not using the data. We've got a huge amount of aged care data, we've got a huge amount of data on all sorts of things, but we don't use it intelligently to give us information, to give us answers, and to, better still, when we think we have the answers and we put them into action, to tell us whether those actions are having real effects and having those effects equitably. So that's what I'd say about data. We definitely need more housing. I think that data's in everybody's faces when you walk down the street. Yeah. You can't avoid it. And sorry, I think I forgot the third bit now. Anyway, so yes, I think we do need to have very intelligent use of data. I wanted to use the data that we do have, that I've internalised, so I'm not going to quote a whole lot of statistics, but it's really bust three myths. And one is that every older person has a house and is asset rich. That's just not true. As Deborah Loxton said, a lot of people are renting. We know from the census that a lot of people over 65 have mortgages. Well, they're actually, if you think about the people who don't own their houses outright, they're the lucky ones, because at least hopefully the mortgage will stay steady if the interest rates don't go up too much. But the people who are renting are really precarious, and they're sort of one pension or one pay packet away from homelessness. And for the women who are in their late 60s, 70s, about 14% of them are still working, and that's because they need to. Usually they need to, because they're often in those precarious situations, but they're working casually and they're working part-time, so their work is precarious, their housing is precarious. So there's a lot of people living precariously as they enter older age. The other myth is that everybody needs care when they're older. That's partly true. We all need care. So that's partly true. But I want to turn that myth around and say that as humans, we are caregivers. That's our role as humans. And sometimes we neglect that because we get hijacked by other ideas. We think our role is to make money or be rich or drive a Lamborghini, but it's not. Our role is to care for other humans. And we hear that from other people when they're talking about their cultures. But that should be the role for all of us, to be caregivers. And women particularly take on this role as part of who they are. And so they take on, so we talk about the burden of care, but actually it's a role of care, it's an identity as a carer. And we carry that through our lives, and we carry that into our older age. So most of the care for older people is being done by older people. We forget that. So women are twice as likely to be caring for somebody in their older age as needing care themselves.
Say that again.
Women are twice as likely to be providing care in older age as needing care themselves. I've been saying that for about 20 years now, so I'm good at saying it. So because we forget that, and but that we know that also that that this care comes on top of long-standing relationships, and those relationships might be good, and those relationships might be bad. And so the caregiving can have good and bad as well. And the conditions that they care for can sometimes be acute on long-standing conditions as well. What we know from listening to the women and what they tell us from the data is that they don't seek help early enough, because help is seen as failure. Help is seen as a last resort. I don't want to put my husband in a nursing home. Well, that shouldn't be the only help you're able to get as a caregiver. There are, and it's not the only help that they can get, but they feel that that's going to be the consequence of asking for help. So I think one of the things we could do is send out a really strong message. Help helps. The women tell us that. Help helps. And what's more is a little bit of help helps a lot. So they're not asking for huge amounts. And when we look at what aged care people get, most people get a very small amount for a long period of time, and they otherwise manage. So we need to be thinking about a small amount of care, a small amount of help earlier in the life course, and for more people, and for it to be seen as a strength and not a weakness and not a failure. So I think that's one thing I'd say. And then finally, I want to talk about aged care, and many people will need some residential aged care towards the end of life, but not all older people are in residential aged care. And residential aged care, when you go in there, shouldn't be seen to be the last in your life, but it's for living. So most people stay in there about 2.5 years. So how do you want to spend the last 2.5 years of your life? And the only other thing I'll say about aged care is that it should be everybody's business. So it's the banks, it's the taxi drivers, it's the gardeners, it's everybody's business, because we all should be living in a community where we're caring for each other.
Okay, and so moving to Terry. Terry, did you want to address that issue of housing as well?
Yeah, sure, I can include it.
If you want to include it, yeah.
Yes, so I'm here this morning on behalf of Maria from FECA, Mary from FECA, who couldn't be here, but as Ethnic Communities Council of New South Wales, we're the sister body of FECA, and there's an ethnic council in each state. So there's quite a lot. I know I need to keep it brief, because last time I went over.
That's right.
So a couple of the things is we talk about policy, but then we talk about practice and what actually gets rolled out on the ground. So a couple of things: are we currently practicing the policies that we have? And when we do get these new policies, are we going to practice those as well? And are we going to implement them on the ground effectively? And that was some of the things and the concerns that we have within the ethnic communities. We talk about data, but we talk about a lot of data, but are we collecting the right data? And is the data including allowing the people that we're collecting from to give solutions as well? So they're the kind of things that we're starting to look at, and we often look at grants that are rolled out for organisations to look at innovation. But wouldn't it be fantastic if we could see grants, we could see opportunities where consumers could actually take that opportunity to look at innovation and solutions themselves, because they come up with the best solutions. They're practical, they're on the ground, and they know in the nitty-gritty at 3 a.m, when you don't have somewhere to go, you've just been attacked, you don't know what you do, you have come up with amazing solutions. So it would be really fantastic to see some of that. When we talk about costing, we often talk about what a program will cost to implement, but we're not often costing what it costs not to implement it. We're not costing if we don't support the person, they end up in hospital, they end up with counselling, they end up in care a lot earlier than they should. What does that cost the government, rather than putting in a service in place at early intervention stages? So that's the kind of thing that we would love to look at. When we talk about data, there's a lot of data out there, but we also question how much of that represents the CALD communities? How many CALD communities are actually participating in that data? And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are doing it very well, but we would love to see a more broader, a more larger representation of CALD communities. And quite often we ask people, participate, tell us what's wrong with the system. And people say, well, I don't know the system well enough to be able to tell you what's wrong with it. I don't speak the language more fluently enough to be able to tell you what's wrong with it. So tell me about it first, and then I'll be able to tell you what's wrong with it. So many of the focus groups that we run, I'll go right back to basics to say, let's tell you what the system is first. Tell us what your experience is, and then you tell us what feels right and what feels wrong. We would love to see a lot more of those practices when it comes to collecting data. We talked about helping, but people can help themselves. We talked about housing, and there's so many opportunities that we've seen with CALD communities that they're coming up with their own housing solutions, because the current housing solutions out there aren't meeting their needs, or the cultural needs, or the crisis needs that they are coming up with. We're seeing women amongst communities that are now widowed that are coming together and actually housing together, which means that aged care services and support services come into the one house, and it's a safe environment as well. So we're looking at a lot of that. When we're developing housing, is it engineered in a way that's going to allow those people to reduce that isolation? Or do you live in this 100 building a room block that the neighbour doesn't know you, you don't have your mailman, you don't have the regular person, you go get your coffee and your milk, for you to go missing one day and someone says, where's Mary? I haven't seen her today. So we are really living in a community very different to what we're used to in our homeland, where the entire community knows you. They haven't seen you for a little while, so they try to look for you. So we're missing that, and so we're creating isolation for people who don't need isolation. If anything, they need to break down some of that as well. We also need to look at forward planning. We know that 2/3 of the women are carers. We know that a large percentage of women are the ones that are going into residential care. Yet, are we planning for those statistics? Are we looking at solutions that are going to meet those statistics? We also look at our communities and we look at the workforce, and a couple of things just very quickly. We look at an ageing workforce, because women predominantly in the ageing industry are older women as well. We are seeing a lot of aged care workers, but then we need skilled aged care workers.
Yeah.
And there's a question whether or not the skills and the training that's out there is really keeping us up to date with the latest changes and the latest issues as well, and whether or not they are able to respond to some of the crises that they're seeing.
All right.
When it comes to elder abuse, we're hearing a lot of our elders and our women saying, why isn't there mandatory reporting? I have got issues with my family. My father's turned up to hospital. It's obvious that he's been abused. I don't have any legal hand to help me. Can someone help me here? So we do need a system in place, or policies, or mandatory reporting. We have it for children. Why don't we have it for elders or people who have dementia, who are fronting to hospitals and not able to tell that something is happening to them as well, which means training the allied health services and your doctors to be able to pick that up as well and do something with that as well. I've got a lot more to do, but I've got to keep going. Okay. That's about it, really. I really should stop there, shouldn't I?
All right, and you can come back to it in questions.
Okay.
Can I jump over? I know we want to talk about finances. I just want to jump over to Susan Ryan and ask you a really difficult thing. And that is, you know, we're talking about the services that are available for women, the suitability of them, and the availability of them. And then there's this other tangent conversation that's running alongside it about this idea of the snowballing of disadvantage over your life, that you're just not arriving at this point. And I'm wondering, that's the hardest thing for government to do, isn't it? To say, it's complicated, it's interconnected, it relates to women's superannuation, it relates to divorce, it relates to domestic violence, it relates to all of these things, so that by the time you're an elder, this is what you're dealing with. I mean, how would you start to unpack that if you were the minister?
Well, the first thing you do is recognise it all. Come to a senior rights forum and you'll learn a hell of a lot. I can say to all my former colleagues in Canberra or up in Macquarie Street. First of all, you need to recognise it. And I think what you've just set out, the accumulation of disadvantage, that by the time you're 70, all these things have happened to you. So you can't undo all those things. So, sorry.
To work, yep.
Are we right?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
You can't undo all of these things.
You can't undo all the things that have happened. But you can look at the big levers for improving what is happening currently. Now, they reside, in my view, with governments, with state governments and federal governments. They reside in the law, but the Parliament makes the law. And we do need a whole lot of much better focused policies emanating from our parliaments, and we do need laws to back them up. Now, there are a couple of opportunities at the moment. First of all, it won't have escaped anybody's attention that early next year we will have two important elections. We will have a state election here and we will have a federal election. Now, to me, those elections are an opportunity for senior rights service, for all the housing advocates, to get in and make sure that as people run around asking for your votes, they make commitments. Now, it's possible, and indeed, to some extent, I must congratulate the housing NGOs, because there have been some important commitments just recently from federal Labor. There are also good policies from state Labor, although, in my view, they haven't been articulated or pushed enough. But I think those things need to be known. We've heard descriptions about some of our community providers getting some funding from that state fund, which funds such things, and that's a good thing. I'm not knocking that. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but it's not enough. We heard one provider said Was she Uniting Care? No, she said they
Baptist
had
Care.
Baptist Care,
Yeah,
300 units. Fabulous Baptist Care. Thank you very much. That's wonderful. 300 older people, probably older women, will get housing. But compared with the waiting list, it's not enough. And there are other community providers who could say the same thing. So it's not enough. It's not enough at state level. And the federal government can't just sit back and say, oh, it's for the states to organise. It isn't. So I think we do, yes, the whole plethora of things. We can't undo the life of a woman who's had a very difficult and disadvantaged life. By the time she's 70, she's facing poverty, homelessness, ill health and so on. But we can do things for her now, and government policy should be much more targeted at doing those things. And let us acknowledge it will cost money. It will cost public funding. Public funding is there. It is available. We suddenly find, because of a whole lot of things that have happened in the world economy, that both in this state and federally, they've got a lot more money than they thought they were going to have. Some of that, a lot of that, should be designated to the basic thing of housing people, whether it's through assisting states with public housing, NGS for community housing, rent control. All of these things do require a government input. They can't be done entirely by philanthropists or fabulous community organisations like the Baptists or St Vincent de Paul. They do a lot, but it's not their job to house every Australian. It's the Australian government's job. So I think that is an opportunity. Same at state level, as I said, there have been some good things, not nearly enough. And the sell-off of public housing, and the one you'll be most familiar with is down in the Rocks, saying that, oh, well, the money we're getting will go for something else. That was almost theft from the public, in my view. And those people who were made homeless by that were not given proper support. Ultimately, when there was so much fuss and trouble and everything, so there was efforts made to find them housing, sometimes at Homebush or something. Now, listen, if you've lived all your life in the Rocks and you're 87, starting again in Homebush. So, look, I don't want to do the whole, but I think the whole housing thing, the role of government. The other thing on aged care and elder abuse, now there is something happening at the moment we all must try to make work in the interests of older people and in eliminating elder abuse, and that's the Royal Commission into Aged Care. Now, I actually agree with Minister Ken Wyatt, who said earlier, look, we don't need a Royal Commission because we know what's wrong.
Right.
Thank you
Yes.
to all these people. We know what's wrong and we know what to do about it. Well, he got overruled and now we're having a Royal Commission. Okay, we're having a Royal Commission. Let's make it matter, because there are some things that, and I can't read Ken Wyatt's mind, but one of the things, and it's already come up today, that would reduce a lot of the mistreatment and abuse of older people, either in residential care or in the home, is staffing, qualified, properly trained staffing, mandating, please. I agree with the Nurses Union, absolutely, mandating a number of registered nurses at every aged care facility and also engaged in the delivery in the home. The reason why we don't have the numbers is that the aged care providers say, oh, well, they're too expensive to hire. I mean, the nurses are willing to do that work, but obviously they need to be paid properly, and they also need to work in a proper professional environment, not where there's perhaps one nurse looking after 80 old people, mostly with dementia, at night. You can understand a nurse saying, I can't deliver. So and then the carers, who are not nurses, again, there are some wonderful, kind, usually women and usually immigrant women working as carers in aged care. Lovely, kind people, but they have not been trained. They have not been trained adequately. They certainly have not been trained for cultural diversity, for LGBTIQ or for Indigenous. They often come from very conservative societies. They're faced with the diversity of life here, and it's very, very difficult for them. They often don't have very good English language skills. So, you're trying to help an old person, they have a stroke or something. What do you do? So training and mandating trained staff in all aspects of aged care. These are things governments can do and should do. We have experts here who can easily tell them how it could be done, and they have to happen. And
Yes.
if we did that,
Okay.
I think a lot of the problems we're talking about today would start to reduce.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susan. And that's interesting because that's the sort of thing a Royal Commission can achieve, right? A Royal Commission's not going to be very good at doing interconnected things, but a Royal Commission can absolutely mandate training standards, nursing numbers and all the rest of it. Let's go to you, Sam, if you can. Taking on that notion of the big levers and what can be pulled in terms of the big levers as you have that first generation certainly not a first generation, but the generation of baby boomer LGBTI people going into becoming elders, whether at home or whether in aged care. Now, you do the work around educating people in terms of attitudes and staffing, but all of that kind of ignores the disadvantage that comes before. Do you think you just section that off at 70 and say, well, that happened, let's make your ageing experience better? How do you deal with that sort of philosophical question?
Funding. Look, it's an interesting question, and I've just been sort of thinking about things as people have been speaking here, and I'll probably go over a few things as well as answering that question. One of the big ones is data. Nobody collects data about LGBTI people.
Right.
Apparently we don't exist. So the census doesn't ask about LGBTI, and the only reason you do get caught in the census is if you're in a same-sex relationship, because it'll ask you the gender of your partner. So that's when you get captured. But anyone else, there's nothing. So there's no question asked. In the survey of disability, ageing and carers, exactly the same. In aged care data collection, exactly the same. I had a look at a couple of the longitudinal studies and I couldn't actually see the questions, but I'm going to guess that no one asked questions about sexuality, gender or intersex status. So we have all this...
Julie's saying she does.
You do?
Yes.
Excellent. Yay. Cheers to you. So there's all this data collection going on, but there's no one actually collecting the data about who LGBTI people are and our experiences and what we're doing. And then when the questions are asked, they can be quite wrong. So asking someone if they're, what's the question at the moment? Intersex, intermediate or undetermined. Not exactly a question you're going to answer easily, because that's certainly not how you see yourself. So I think one of the big issues for LGBTI across lifespan is around that data collection and good data collection. And then what we find out is the responses that are developed from the research are actually not applicable or not fully applicable to people who are LGBTI, because it doesn't consider the life experiences and that accumulated discrimination and impact. It doesn't look at that people who were, for lesbian women in particular, who have never had a male partner, who therefore won't have the benefit of superannuation from their male partner before women could actually gain superannuation. So those kind of issues just don't get looked at and don't get picked up in responses. There is a lot more research happening. There's a great bit of research happening at the moment called Rainbow Ageing, which will does look across the lifespan and that those experiences and what that has meant for LGBTI elders and older people. But like most of the research, we get really good responses from lesbian women and gay men, but really hard to get information from trans and intersex and bisexual people. And quite often that's because of the way the questions are asked, or the questions that are in those papers. They actually exclude people from responding to those questions. So I certainly pick up on some of the comments here about talk to people and ask them what the questions are. I mean, we often get to have a look at those questions and go, oh, no, look, this is what you need to change. But talk to the elders and older people and say, well, what are the questions you need asked that you need to answer? And how do we ask those questions in a really culturally safe and inclusive way that you can answer them? So really important to listening to the voices. And it's something we're doing and a lot of conferences are doing now. We often have an LGBTI panel now of elders and older people, and we get them to answer the questions from people in the audience. We get them to talk about their life experiences, because only they can tell you about that journey. There's also those really big issues of intersectionality and invisibility. Quite often when we look at LGBTI, we think white. We very rarely talk about cultural diversity, spirituality, Aboriginal, LGBTI. It's kind of, we're all in these nice little boxes and we very rarely look at that intersectionality and what does that accumulation of discrimination mean for someone if you're a woman and you're Aboriginal and you're a lesbian and you're trans? You know, what's that impact on you for your life, and what does that mean, and how does that affect you? In terms of solutions, I'm thinking, you know, we really need to address ageism and sexism, but changing the depiction of how we depict older people in the media and in newspapers and on television, and we've got to challenge that, because we're not going to change a lot in society until we start challenging how we see older people and how we think they are. And it needs to start from primary school. I think we can have these discussions with older people or with people sort of, you know, midlife maybe, but we don't talk to children about what is ageing and what does that mean, and what does diversity as ageing mean, and what do you need to do to think about as you're ageing and for your grandparents and parents. I also think there's still a bit of definitely a sexism in legislation. I mean, you sort of think about the King Hit policy. Someone gets King Hit, legislation changes, everything, you know, escalates, and this is really bad. A woman dies nearly every day from violence, but tumbleweeds. You know, where's the outburst angry response to that from the government? Where's the legislative changes to that? And often I think we also develop policies for men and apply them to women, or we develop policies for heterosexual women and apply them to lesbian and bisexual and trans women. So we don't look at those intersections of diversity again and what we need to do to actually make these services inclusive and actually have good policy responses across the board. The work we're doing, yep, look, we do training, but that training is about looking at the life experiences of LGBTI elders and older people. So going, you know, this person isn't coming into your service at this age in this nice little box and this is what they need. It's saying this is their life experiences, this is what they've grown up through, this is what they've experienced, this is the consequences of those experiences, and this is how you can work with that person to be safe in your service provision, and how you can work with them and make your service inclusive. So it's not sort of in this nice little cut-off box. We do have the diversity framework, which was launched last year. So that's looking at all diversities and about aged care having to think about all diversities in aged care and how they address those needs. And there's some really specific action plans coming out now on LGBTI, CALD and Aboriginal people. And we're about to start working on homelessness too. So what aged care providers need to do to be inclusive of all these different groups as well.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sam. Do you remember just, was it last week? So much goes on in federal politics, it's hard to remember where you are at any given moment in time. The economic security statement for women, you're laughing, emergency access to super in cases of DV, loans for women fleeing domestic violence. Angela, what was your response to that other than a chuckle?
It's really interesting that when you talk about women's issues, the onus to fix it is on women, right? So domestic violence, let's give women a loan that they have to repay. Let's take money out of their superannuation. It doesn't work. This has got to be a government response. You can't say that women have got to fix things. Oh, you got raped. Well, what were you wearing? You know, we don't tell people to stay out of the ocean because there are shark attacks. We deploy drumlines and we cull sharks. You know, so I really think that the ministers for women that we've seen under the coalition government have been a succession of failures, starting with Abbott and coming to O'Dwyer. So really, I'm not sure they've got any genuine ideas for how to fix things for women. I don't think I should answer that question. It's interesting what you say about the Royal Commission and the idea of a Royal Commission. Oh, we know everything. There's no, you know, we know what needs fixing. Well, they said that about the Banking Royal Commission, didn't they?
Right.
And you've all been following that, I would no doubt imagine. I think that both Susan and Sam made really good points about the accumulation of disadvantage. And I come to this from a trade union perspective. So I look at workers. And really, if you're a woman and you work, the disadvantage begins the moment you step into the workplace. We have a gender pay gap. In my industry, it's over 30%. Just think about that for a moment. And this is full-time equivalent. This is not taking into account part-time or casual or anything else, a 30% gender pay gap. So when that happens from the very beginning of your career, is it any shock that by the time you get to retirement, what you've got isn't enough? And in terms of research, there's been plenty of research. The Senate did a fabulous report called A Husband is Not a Retirement Plan in 2016, aptly named, you might agree. We've got the McKell Institute that did a lovely report in 2017. We've had Australian Super and Monash University do another report this year. There's plenty of data. We all know what's wrong. We've just got to actually adopt the policies that are required to fix it. So when we talk about those policy settings, we need to think about eliminating the gender pay gap, because that will at least mean that when you are working and you are attracting superannuation, it's at the same rate as the blokes. So that'll go some way to doing that, but that's really hard because we need things like pay transparency. We need to know what people earn. We need a reporting regime that's got carrots in it, so when the employers don't report, there's actually some punitive punishment for them not reporting, because at the moment the only punishment is you can't go for government tenders. Well, if you're 150 employees in a small credit union on the north coast of New South Wales, you don't really care about government tenders. You care more about your information being made public. So I think that some reporting needs to change. I think that other things we know, women take time out of the workforce to care for their children. And until we restructure the paid parental leave scheme, which, by the way, over 99% of people who access that are birth mothers, we need to restructure that to try and get men out of the workforce, to try and be taking that care, because then they set examples. People see that there are blokes out of the workforce, other blokes see other blokes doing it. We need to structure it so that men can do it, not necessarily in a block of time. Maybe they do it 1 or 2 days a week while the birth mother goes back to work part-time and they take some time off to care for the baby so the baby doesn't have to go into care. There are lots of different ways of restructuring parental leave. We need to be paying superannuation on parental leave. And you know what? Employers need to step up. They benefit from the money that is made of profits that's generated from our community, and parental leave should be at full replacement wage. It should be paid by the employer because they get the benefit from it. Government paying for it is a cop-out. I understand why it was done, but really employers need to step up and take on some of the contribution to social matters in our society. It's not enough for just to be government. I take your point, Susan, and there is funding and government should do more. But actually, the profits, particularly out of my industry, the billions of dollars that are made that come out of all of our pockets because we're paying those fees, some of that needs to be reinvested in the community, and I think they can do more in that space. I also think that superannuation needs to be compulsory on every single dollar you earn from the very first dollar. So we need to get rid of the $450 cap, and it shouldn't be staggered. I know the ALP's come out with some really good things actually with respect to fixing super, but it shouldn't be staggered. It's $450 a month. The definitions of work have changed since the superannuation scheme was brought in the late 80s. It is no longer the norm that people work full-time from when they finish their education until they retire, particularly for women. So we need to get rid of that cap that we're currently seeing on superannuation. And when you're getting a government payment, that should attract superannuation. We don't need more research that shows that the investment now by government pays off in retirement. That we've seen all the research. We know that you're better off spending the money now. So if you're on a parenting payment, if you're on a carer's wage, if you're on Newstart, that should attract superannuation. And we shouldn't be taking out a superannuation for things like boob jobs. You know, maybe that's a little radical.
What, the boob job or don't know?
No, well, the people actually access
it's going in
superannuation
directions
for
we
those
never
sorts of things.
anticipated,
It's
isn't it?
kind of outrageous. But I do think that we need to make it easier for employers to positively discriminate against men when it comes to superannuation. So right now, in order for an employer to provide more superannuation to the women that need it, they need to apply for special dispensation in order to do that because of our anti-discrimination provisions. So we need to do things that make it easier for smaller employers who perhaps don't employ the research people, the policy people that can engage with government. We need to actually make it easier and have policy settings in place that recognise that where there are great deficits in women's superannuation, that those women can have their superannuation topped up by an employer. Because if you just top it up for both, you're still going to have the same gap. You know, you go from 9 to 12, but you start here and here, and that just continues continues to go, to grow. So we need to make it easier to positively discriminate. I could probably talk on this for hours, but I'm not going to. But there's lots of good things that we can do to try and do things, but it's got to be from day one. It's not enough to get to retirement and suddenly realise there's a problem, we've got to fix it. We've got to fix the structural disadvantage from day one when you're 14 or 15 or 16 or 25 when you start in the workplace.
Interesting. Interesting. All right, so we want to turn to questions now. We have questions coming in from the web. We'll have questions from the floor here as well. And I think Diana has a iPad. Okay, no worries. We have a question here in the middle of the room. Get a mic down there. Thank goodness you wore your flat shoes. There you are. And over on this side of the room, Tom.
On housing, I live in a 48 flat, 2-bedroom flats in Burwood that nobody could afford now anyway. I bought it a long time ago. Now, in that block, 48 flats, there's one flat that's been empty for about 5 years. The owner lives in Hong Kong. As on the Strata Committee, I've been trying to persuade her to sell it. The problem is that this is just one out of 48. I know there are thousands of empty properties in Sydney, let alone, heaven knows, in Australia. Now, these could have all been commandeered if they're not rented out by a government policy and given to to live in for people. Now, that's one issue. The other issue on housing, I have a friend who's an example of a woman who was caring for a partner. She's 78. She and her partner bought a flat, sold the house, bought a flat, downsized. Her partner's now dead. She can no longer afford to live in that flat because of the strata fees and other costs, because she's on a fixed pension. So what happens is, as you age, sometimes your finances become more difficult and you're on your own. But moving, as was mentioned, into other housing, she's quite fit and capable and look after herself, is really difficult. So this is just an example of how we need, even people who've bought a place suddenly find themselves financially stressed, as well as people who are homeless. And it's a really serious matter, and I would like to see those empty places filled.
Okay. So the Victorian government introduced, or said it would introduce, and they were re-elected, you might have noticed, the vacant residential property tax, which was to be levied on dwellings that are vacant more than 6 months in a calendar year, and I can find the rate for you if you like. Any thoughts on empty houses with housing needs?
I think the thing to pull that up a bit is to talk about the tax settings that we have in our country and how that's actually not about people having homes, but allowing investors to speculate in our housing market. And so one of the things, in addition to asking for a lot more social and affordable housing, we're also campaigning to get the negative gearing and capital gains tax settings changed so that we have houses that are homes rather than investment. In terms of vacant properties, I will say that in Sydney, we've done some research around it. It isn't actually that big an issue, mainly because you can make so much money in the private rental market at the moment that it's of benefit to rent out. So whilst it may be an issue in other places like Melbourne, it's not as big an issue in Sydney.
Okay. Anyone else on the panel? Jodie?
It came up in the workshops on the Constellation project because we're sort of doing the brainstorming around what are some of the solutions and the big solutions and mobilising capital. We had people there, so it's Mission Australia, Red Cross, Centre for Social Impact and PwC, but we also had NAB people there, CBRE, and so it was a real sort of brainstorming about what can some of the solutions. So the vacant housing did come up, but also vacant other buildings that are sitting around, that often you see these buildings sitting there vacant. What are some innovative ways that architects can actually use those as housing for people? Because I think there's a whole area to explore there, but it's definitely one of the action plans that that group is looking at.
And what are your thoughts on it? I mean, I love the use of the word commandeering,
Yeah.
as if, it's something you can do in wartime, but
Well, I think
not something otherwise.
It's a bit of a carrot and stick. I think there can also be incentives as well as disincentives to leave places vacant. So yes, there can be tax disincentives, but there might be incentives. And I think the ACT government were looking at some sort of incentive for people to actually put their put their vacant housing into social housing pools.
Right.
So rather than rent it out for the full market rent, actually allow a social housing provider to utilise that property, get less rent, but not be penalised by the tax office.
As a result of doing that. Yeah. There's a question at this side of the room and then down the front.
Hello everyone, my name is Charlotte Steer and I'm one of the lawyers at Seniors Rights Service, and one of the things we do is give advice about housing law. Recently we've got funding to give advice to people who live in strata for the first time, to everyone in New South Wales. But in my other hat, I teach at the University of New South Wales and I teach a subject called housing law. So I'm always thinking about law reform in housing, and you've mentioned a couple of them. Catherine mentioned getting rid of no grounds evictions so that landlords have to give a reason for an eviction to increase security of tenure. You've mentioned law reform in return, Mary, in relation to mandatory reporting of elder abuse, which is another way of keeping people safe in their home or in their residential facility. And we've had various other suggestions about law reform to existing laws. But I also want to think about law reform for new laws that we can bring in. And I'm going to ask you, the question that's coming up in a second is, what's your burning thing that you would like to have? So some existing laws, like introducing pay transparency, for example. But new laws, what new laws would you like to see? And I'm going to give you 3 that are on my wish list. And they're on my wish list because they enact housing as a human right. So the first thing I want, let's think big. The United Nations, Australia is currently participating in the drafting of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older People. And that will help to change the discourse in Australia from protection and care and charity and vulnerability and disability to rights. Older people have rights and older people are entitled to stand up for their rights. And therefore I'd also like to see a Human Rights Act in New South Wales, as we have equivalents in ACT and Victoria. But the thing that I'm passionate about since I started working at the Seniors Rights Service and working alongside the aged care advocates is the limited rights that people have living in aged care. If you live in any other type of housing, you've got a right to go to a tribunal or a court to enforce obligations about behaviour and services. But if you live in aged care, you can only make a complaint to the police, who may or may not do something, or to the aged care commissioner, who may or may not do something. But you don't have a right to take action yourself in a tribunal to enforce your rights. So I'd like to see a Residential Aged Care Act that's modelled on the Residential Tenancies Act that took effect across Australia through a referral of power under the Constitution. So those are my 3 new laws that I would like to have. Over to you. What's on your wish list? I want to know.
Sounds like I should write down that's a submission to the Royal Commission right there, isn't it? I was taking notes if you need them later.
Done that.
You've done that. Right. Well done you. Anyone else? Legal reform. I think some issues have been mentioned. Terry, you've got a thought?
We were actually talking during the break with Tony and Jimmy from the Arab Council in regards to the legal system and how women who go through divorce or they're going through the system, the inequality that happens and the way the system does not support them, and women suddenly find themselves paying extensive legal bills.
Yes.
And by the time they get to the end of it, there's no money left over for them. And their partner may have already distributed some of their income or some of the housing, and they haven't got the support. There's so many complexity. I don't know, Tony, if you wanted to add something to the conversation we had, but the legal system is not set up to encourage women to go through the legal system at the moment. And so there's a lot of discouragement there to do that.
Maybe Tony could just...
Tony might want to add to that.
And then we'll go up to the back of the room.
Yes, my name is Tony Barber, I'm a lawyer. I guess really talking about the legal system, I get very discouraged as a lawyer to see a mother with 2 or 3 children spending $200,000 or $300,000 in a litigation when the total asset pool is no more than $1 million. Now, what is she going to end up with? 3-5 years of litigations, $300,000-$400,000 to lawyers. what she's going to end up with, where she's going to live, what she's going to do with three children,
that's what
with a
she gives
husband
up,
that has
right?
distributed all the assets to the family under cover of owing money and, you know, I don't work anymore. I'm no longer an employee of the company was generating all this income for me. And that is really a difficulty. And I think the courts do contribute to a large extent to this dilemma. They don't have the mechanism to deal with this quickly. They've talked about evidence, which really, I mean, it's our system and I accept that. But sometimes there is no sympathy towards people who are in this position, which first of all can't afford it, they don't have the resources, they don't have the money, and how could you fight? Whether you're fighting a bank, we're talking about the Royal Commission, or whether you're fighting someone who's funded and very resourced, how could you do that? It's impossible. And the system contributes to it mostly, and that's got to change.
Yeah.
And talking about my friends here, seeing the things she wishes to have in relation to the acts, I mean, there should be an act to local government and all the people here talking about housing. That's where most local houses are, development application, rest of it. There should be some mechanism to tie up all these developments, all these people making money in developments, to try and put something aside for all the elderly, all the other people. A council selling a house, a park for development, and then no money at all for people who really need the houses in this area. They sell it to a developer who makes most money. They can force him into putting some money aside.
Thank you for that contribution.
I was just
Thank you
going to
very
pick up.
much.
Sorry, I was just going to pick up on the new. I don't know if it's new legislation, but I'd certainly like to see all the remaining discrimination against LGBTI people removed from all pieces of legislation. I think that would make a big difference. And also, if you go to the Silver Rainbow website, we're working with international organisations on a call to action recognising the rights of older LGBTI people. So it'd be great to see people sign up to that.
Wonderful. At the back of the room, patient.
Hi, my name's Sam. I'm from the Committee for Sydney. I think everybody's touched on here the concept of housing as a right, which is absolutely something that I support and that I think everybody here would support. And the question was raised earlier about vacant homes, and it got me thinking about actually it's not just the homes that are vacant on their own. There's actually a lot of homes where there might be somebody living in it, but 2 or more bedrooms free. Now, in 2016, the Department of Planning put out some statistics and said there's almost 500,000 homes that fall into this category. That's 20 years worth of housing supply in bedrooms that is sitting there essentially unused. And you've got organisations like the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, which is looking at encouraging co-sharing, particularly older women, maybe what incentives we can give to get them to encourage them to go into the market and offer it to other older women that may need more affordable rental properties and things like that. So I don't think it's just a question of the house as a whole. There is a lot of empty bedrooms that we could use. But when we do talk about this need to build a lot more public housing, and I think the figures that we use today are absolutely right, I am conscious that what you often see, and this is true for boarding homes, it's true for anything in the social housing space, but certainly if you're looking at aged care, that when somebody goes in with an application to build more boarding housing or affordable aged care accommodation, there is often a bit of a community backlash to the development, and it's the usual sort of things you see around traffic, or it's out of character with the neighbourhood, and it upsets me, and I wonder about when we're talking about this scale of public housing that we need to build, when we're talking about aged care housing, we don't want to create a situation where it all gets built on the urban fringe, because that will create huge social isolation issues if people are forced to move out of where they live. So how do we bring the community along with us? How can we use the momentum of the Aged Care Royal Commission to encourage communities that actually new supply of housing for lower income groups and retirees is a good thing, and that might mean some trade-offs in how we currently view our community. So I'd be keen to hear any thoughts that people have on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because it goes to trust. I live in a local government area where the Mayor decided that he wanted to do a 6 to 8 storey development right behind a heritage area, failed to lodge the minute on the website, and then 3 weeks later, Council announced they were going to have a broad community consultation about what we'd like the area to look like. Forgive the cynicism. Trust is at the heart of that, isn't it? Trust in the planners of our communities is really at the heart of that, and you'd have to say it's pretty battered. Thoughts?
Rather than trust, I'd go for the law. Yeah. I do not trust developers, actually. But now we have had proposals in the state of New South Wales for mandating affordable housing up to 25% of all new developments should be mandated for affordable housing. That is not current government policy. I hope it will be the policy if we have a change of government. I'll give you some examples. Take Barangaroo. Now, Barangaroo was public property. Mm-hmm. The developers put in tenders, they developed it. A housing expert, Professor Peter Phibbs from Sydney University, said about 3% of all those apartments that have been built right there are affordable. Now, that could have been changed by law. Similarly, and I agree with, we don't want to just put people on the other side. If Green Square, how many thousand, you'd probably know, like it's like a whole town, Green Square. How much of that is affordable? Was there an affordability mandate? Yes. There's another one out near Pagewood, which is, again, it's a very convenient area, Anzac Parade, you know, near the beaches, plenty of schools. There's, Americans have got, 3,000 new apartments just going up on what was previously public land. What was the requirement to put aside 25%? Catherine, was there any?
No, not.
I don't believe there was. So while, you know, trust is a concept we would like to feel we can advance, we need laws that says, you come along to do this 3,000 unit development, you want to charge $2 million upwards for everyone. Well, no, 25% of them have to be a formula, which Catherine's organisation and others can help you work out, that has to be affordable, and that means pensioners, old people, people on low income, people with disability can afford to live there. And the good thing about that, one of the good things is that if you've got a big development, say 25% are people on very low incomes, the rest aren't, you get more of a social mix. And who knows what positives can come out of that.
I think just to add to Susan's comments too, we also need leadership on this. So there's been no conversation, particularly in Sydney. We don't have a housing plan. We don't have an affordable housing plan. We don't have any plans around or conversation around what kind of city do we want to be living in, how, you know, what kind of city do we want to be living in 20 to 30 years' time. And you might have seen recently that Berejiklian and Scott Morrison have come out saying that Sydney's full. I mean, that's not the most helpful way to have those conversations about community and what community needs to look like and who should be living where and so on. It's a really unhelpful, in many ways, way to be approaching that. And so we've formed, again, with a number of other organisations to start the conversation about needing to talk about growth in Sydney. Sydney is going to grow. It is one of the major, you know, cities of Australia, and it should be a global city. But what we need to be doing is having a conversation about what that growth means and what does that mean, particularly for people at risk of homelessness, but for really disadvantaged people. How do we make sure we've got a city that does have a diverse range of homes and types of housing so that people can live close to where they work, they can get to and from where they need to go to without battling transport, and we're not having those conversations. So alongside the legislation and the policy, we need the leadership and conversation around what we want in cities in Australia.
Okay, a couple of quick comments down the end, and then we've got a question here and a question from someone watching on the web.
It even goes further than that. Are we building livable communities? Are we building communities that has parking, that has pathways that we can walk on, has disability access?
Yeah.
We talked about, again, the blue zones. We talked about places across the world where we can live comfortably and well. Are we building cities that is reducing isolation, creating engagement and creating healthy communities?
And we know how to do it. There's plenty of information.
Yeah, I mean, you try and park in Waterloo or Green Square.
No.
And the other problem that we have as well is while these people are being moved so that we can create these developments, what support is given to them, what consultation is happening, so that they are supported through this process. Many
Yeah.
people are living in limbo.
Yeah.
And I know in some of our many areas, the Indigenous communities and a very large Russian and many other Cald communities that are, we talked about being obvious. There are many ethnic communities in those areas that are not obvious.
Yeah.
They're within the grassroots there. They don't know what's happening. There's transitions that are happening. They're going to be moved out. They don't know when they're going to be coming back. So there's a lot of that hesitancy and stress around living in those areas at the moment.
A quick comment from Julie, and then we'll go to two last questions, which we'll take back to back.
So it's a really quick comment, and that is there's more to New South Wales than Sydney.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to say this lady here, and then, all right, we'll take this one here, and unfortunately the web, and then we might have to live there.
I'm Kate Turner from the Older Women's Network.
Hello.
And one of the things we did some years ago was hold a workshop with our members, there would have been roughly 50 present, to find out what they felt about housing sharing.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell you, they all said no.
Yeah. Safety, safety was the issue, or
They just didn't
expectations?
want to have a stranger.
Yeah.
No matter what the arrangement was,
Yeah.
they just didn't want it. So it's not solving the problem.
Yeah.
It's not solving the problem. In this Older Women's Network, we have a theatre group who perform, and one of their members is here today. And they have a program called Don't Knock Your Granny. And that program talks about elder abuse in a nursing home. It also talks about homelessness. And I think if anyone is interested in presenting a theatrical situation, please contact our theatre group and
Wonderful.
they will come and perform for you.
Terrific. All right.
I
I'd just like to say that we just performed at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival.
Did you?
Good on you.
But it went down really well, and we had women's groups from very many places come, so yes.
All right. Okay, so can we go to the...
Can I just make a final comment and properly ask a question?
Uh-huh.
I personally live in a block of units that were built by the Theosophical Society about 50 years ago. And they raised the money themselves and were given a dollar for dollar contribution from the government, provided the place was not exclusively for people from the Theosophical Society. And I've been lucky enough, mainly through the Older Women's Network, to have obtained a place there. I'm a pensioner and have been since I turned 60 because I had breaks in my working career for various reasons. The thing about this place is it's now an incorporated association and we pay 18% of our income. So as a pensioner, I'm not paying a vast amount. And it means that I've been able to live a good life.
Yeah.
Now, I can't see why. There's only 12 units. It's small. It's not one of these high-rise apartment buildings, of which there's one near my place where there are 20 stories and the advertised as rental only. And when I rang them to find out what the rent was, $800 a
Wow,
week
okay.
was the minimum.
All right, well, listen, we must...
Now, I want to know if the homeless
Yes,
people are
think
looking
that
at
model...
other ways
Yeah.
of building accommodation that
All right.
can be done, that can be affordable.
Okay.
And the answer is yes. I mean, we've worked with a number of different community housing providers in particular around different ways of delivering affordable housing for older women, and Women's Housing Company is in the room, is one of them who are really committed to that. But I guess I'm just going to pull it back up to there are, as Susan's mentioned, there's a state election and a federal election, and to really solve the problem we need investment, significant investment in social and affordable housing. So yes, absolutely we support those kinds of models, but what we need to see is significant systemic change.
So final question is one from the web.
It was just a housing question as well, or not just. It was a question about the older Aboriginal women who used to live in the block, and whether they had been given some accommodation in the new developments. I'm
Does
not sure
anyone
if
know the
anyone
answer?
knows the
Do you
answer
know
to
the
that.
answer to that? It's just a microphone. If you,
Sorry, 62 houses and then
just a sec. Yeah.
4 people there.
62 houses are meant to replace the original houses that are on the block. The difficulty that is now being faced is that the lodgement of the plan does not include any provision for low-cost housing or affordable housing. The 62 houses is meant to go ahead, as with the 25-storey student accommodation at the north end of the block, but there is no guarantee, either at the state planning level or now with the Sydney Authority, that are now looking at the total plan, that there will be low-cost housing or that the housing on the block will not be sold. The condition is that it would be sold to an Aboriginal person, but it's freehold land. And after that, that person is quite free to sell the land to whoever they want. So there's a real tension with... I live on the block, sorry, so this is this is my home. And I'm looking at that area that people squatted in, that people have struggled for, to ensure an Aboriginal presence in Sydney. And I am now frightened that we are going to lose that Aboriginal presence, not by the university, not by the state government, not by the planning authority, but by the Aboriginal Housing Company itself.
Wow. Okay. Thank you very much for that. I'm sorry for the questions we couldn't to get to, but what an interesting idea. I can't remember the last time that housing policy... you want to make a quick comment?
Yes, please. I'm sorry, everyone, but
no, not at all.
I think something that... Thank you for that. It was wonderful. I think that something really has to be put on the record here. Auntie Jenny Munro, who has been totally discredited for her stand at the block, she saw this coming. This academic Aboriginal woman saw this coming. She was discredited widely, and just loved you to just remember in your minds, if you hear the name Jenny Munro, please, just from me, I'm saying she saw this coming.
Right.
Don't listen to the discredited stuff around.
Interesting. Thank you very much for that. Very, very quick.
Very quick. We're talking about voting and elections coming up, and when it comes to our CALD communities and our diverse communities, many of them aren't registered, many of them don't vote, they don't know what they're voting for. So at the moment, the ECC New South Wales is partnering with the Australian Electoral Commission and New South Wales Electoral Commission to run information on ethnic radio about how to vote correctly in Western Sydney. We'd love to see some of these discussions happening on air so that people can make their candidates accountable and start saying this is what we want.
Yeah.
So if you want to partner or talk to us about that, we'll be doing that in January, February and March.
That's an interesting theme. Thank you very much for that, mentioning that. I'm going to pass back over to Russell as you thank the members of the panel very much. But a very strong theme there coming through about housing and an emphasis on housing, which I don't think we've seen for decades as a major election issue, and it certainly gels with all the issues around livability and infrastructure and the rest. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and thank you for all the panellists, both the ones who are on the stage now and the panel that we heard earlier this morning. Just in wrapping up, I just wanted to make one particular point, because it's something that Sam knows that I always push my barrow around on this particular issue around LGBTI ageing. I know it's broader than just older lesbian women. But the fact of religious freedoms in aged care facilities. So we hear a lot of stories at the moment in the media about religious freedoms in schools. The reality is that aged care facilities, faith-based aged care facilities, can fire LGBTI workers in their facilities. So that has a negative impact on older LGBTI people who might be getting care in those facilities. I'd like to thank everybody today for coming, again, particularly braving the weather this morning. I just encourage people who don't know much about Seniors' Rights Service. There's a lot of material out there. Please feel free to grab some of our brochures and some of our reports that are out there. Lunch, we'll be breaking for lunch now. There's 2 lunch stations, one in this area and then one sort of behind the auditorium. And there's also membership forms. If anybody in the audience is not a member of Seniors' Rights Service, you're welcome to pick up a membership form and fill that out. We'll be breaking for lunch now, probably coming back at close to 1:15, where Seniors' Rights Service will have its annual general meeting. You don't have to stay for that, but if people want to stay, you're welcome to. And again, thanks so much for the conversation. I think it's been a very interesting event and something that we'll be certainly building on in the new year. All the best. Bye.